Welcome back to Lokad TV. I'm your host Conor, and as always, I'm joined in studio by Lokad founder Joannes Vermorel. Joining us remotely today is Dan Scharneck. He's the Director of Supply Chain at Trek, and he's going to talk to us about forecasting demand with configurability. Dan, welcome to Lokad.
Hey Conor, hey Joannes. Good to speak with you guys.
Right, Dan, so before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's talk a little bit about Trek. I mean, a lot of people have heard of Trek. I've heard of Trek, some of my friends, but what exactly is it that Trek does?
Well, I mean, we're a bike company. We sell bikes. We view ourselves as a hospitality company. So to us, it's all about giving that experience to the customer. So whether you go to a Trek retail store, you go to a Trek event, you buy one of our products, it's all about just providing incredible hospitality. And we think by extension, we'll get more people on bikes, and that's a good thing for Trek, good thing for the planet. So that's Trek bikes.
And what exactly is it that separates buying, let's say, a high-end Trek bike from buying any other high-end bike? I mean, it's not just the hospitality, I presume.
Yeah, well, so I think that's where, so the business that my team is responsible for is the Project One aspect of Trek, and that's our custom bike business. And it's $6,000 to $10,000, $15,000 bikes, so very expensive high-end bikes. We offer a wide selection of choice, whether it's paint colors, all the parts can be chosen on the bike. So you really get to make it yours, and that there really is no other bike company in the world doing it at the scale that we are at that high-end price point.
And that's the configurability that you're talking about, the optionality that a customer has when they decide to buy a high-end bike.
It is. So, I mean, if there's really kind of two buckets of configurability we offer. So paint and color choice is kind of the first one. And a lot of people want, if you're spending that kind of money on a bike, you want it to be yours. So we offer, the standard, here's 6 really cool colors. We have curated designs from our designers that you can choose, or you can go all the way to just have a color palette and pick which colors go at which part of the bike. So a lot of choice and time can go into the configurability of color. The part selection, so the parts that go on the bike is where my team spends, and we work with Lokad on a lot more of the complexities. So for those of you who don't ride bikes and maybe tuning into this, it's very common for riders to spend 2-3 hours on a bike ride, all day events, sometimes it's multi-day events. So many hours spent on a bike. You really want it to be comfortable and fit you. So, one example I'd give is one of our flagship road bikes, there's like 36 different handlebar options. And it's not that they're all that different, but there's different sizing depending on your shoulder width. You could have different stem length depending on how flexible your hips are, how long your torso is. So all of that is really important to have a bike that is fit for you. And we just think that if you're a customer spending that kind of money, you should get it straight from the factory that works for you. So that's the kind of configurability that we offer in the Project One part of the business.
Well, it occurs to me in terms of a business model, that must increase the logistical complexity significantly. I mean, again, it seems pretty obvious, but compared to, let's say, just buying a regular high-end fixed bike and a configurable bike that might have, I don't know, I mean, how many parts are on a regular Trek bike?
150 to 200, depending on if it's, e-bike or non-e-bike. But you're right, the complexity of buying all the parts, waiting for the customer to tell you their configuration, and then delivering that in a relatively short lead time. So, our challenge and where we've reached out and started working with Lokad for the last couple of years is how can we make better decisions with all these choices, spending our dollars more efficiently, and just making sure we can actually provide that hospitality to our customers. But you're right, it's significantly more complex than ordering 50 black bikes at lead time, putting them on a boat, they show up at the warehouse. And then there's a market for those kind of bikes, but at the high end, we really think configuration is the way to go.
Well, actually, Joannes, thank you, Dan. Joannes, I'll kick it over to you now. In terms of the combinatorial complexity that Dan just described, I'm going to presume it's significant. I mean, 150 to 200 parts, 36 separate handlebars. I'm going to presume combinatorially that's more than 50 or 60 different combinations. So what's the order of magnitude there we're talking about?
So, I mean, the numbers becomes very quickly gigantic, but also slightly meaningless, because if you have, even if you have like 10 options, where each options have like 10 possibilities, you get 10 to the power 10, you know, number of combinations. But the numbers become so large, it's a bit meaningless because it doesn't also truly reflect the actual complexity with of the supply chain. So it grows, you know, in a pure combinatorial fashion, it grows completely out of hand, although it is still possible for companies without having, you know, billions and billions of inventory to actually cope with that. So it's I would say we should not be confusing, you know, the raw combinatorial explosions, which gives, you know, absolutely gigantic numbers with the actual, I would say, the growth in terms of supply chain costs, which are growing quite steadily, but not nearly as fast as the raw combinatorial explosion would suggest. Although the interesting thing is that if you go back, you know, a century in the past, the idea of having a lot of configurability was much more the norm. Actually, if you go back, you know, again, a century in the past, there were much more options on cars, much more options on tons of, I would say, pieces of equipment, things you would not suspect. So you would, many pieces of, I would say, industrial, I would say of machinery, you would go to a clerk and they would note exactly what you want. And they would deliver. It would take maybe 6 months or a year, and they would deliver the thing that is fairly customized. And in order to basically make things massively cheaper, pretty much all industries went into a short list of products, and this is it. And you pick a quality point that can be fairly high, let's say like Apple with the iPhone, so that's a high quality, but still very, very few choices, or it can be very, very cheap, and again, very few choices. So it was not just, I would say, a matter of quality or no quality. It was more like at a given quality level, by having very few options was making it so much easier to scale, and thus that was, let's say, the dominant strategy. And it worked to a large degree, but now I would say beginning of 20th century, companies find themselves again with the idea that, well, if you can give more flexibility to your customers, you can deliver a lot more value. And that's interesting because I think that's also part of the general trends of the 21st century, which is to use supply chain as a differentiator in terms of use of consumer experience. One way to do that is to do it e-commerce. So e-commerce is just, well, you can come to our store, or we can send the thing to you. So that basically taking care of the last mile delivery is a way to replace, I would say, a customer problem by supply chain problem. You just deal with the last mile the delivery instead of your customer. But configurability is also kind of the same thing. You essentially add supply chain complexity in exchange for better customer experience. And here, that's the interesting thing is that I believe that generally speaking, a lot of customers like the idea for their bigger purchases to be able to customize. I've seen that for Dell literally conquered the world by having very, very customizable setups for computers. They have been doing that for more than 2 decades. Companies selling expensive pieces of furniture, like sofas, let you, pick the things, piece by piece. If you want a corner, a shape, materials, and whatnot, and you end up with 20 different settings for your $5,000 sofa. And so even I would say car manufacturers nowadays tend to gradually reintroduce configurability, although they had it's a market that is so insanely driven by prices that it's very difficult to open up on this front. But a lot of, let's say, the expensive German cars, you would pick a lot of options, and then they would just say, well, if you want your, let's say, Mercedes, it's going to take you a year to be delivered. So you can pick all the options, and then it takes forever to be delivered. But in some markets, people are willing to wait that long. In some other markets, let's say bikes, people have expectation that they will be able to enjoy the new bike for, let's say, the summer. So it should not take a whole year for the products to be delivered.
Well, actually, on that point, thank you, Joannes. I'll turn back to you, Dan. I mean, is that more or less the pain point, or what exactly was the challenge that Trek had in terms of delivering the configurable bikes?
Yeah, I mean, Joannes hit it right on. So offering the choice is really good, but then there's two really important things. One is delivering it in a reasonable time frame. We say that's 30 days or less anywhere in the globe for a bike. You know, in a lot of markets, the summer riding season is pretty short, so even 30 days could be a long time. And then you need to reliably tell them when they're going to get their bike. And both of those things I think we're improving on with a lot of the work we're doing with Lokad. There's a lot of things out of our control that happen in the supply chain. But yeah, I mean, completely agree. Just fast or relatively fast delivery for a custom product and reliable.
And in terms of determining, let's say, inventory levels for all of these parts, historically, how did Trek manage that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets into a little bit like how we started looking at maybe there's a better way to do things, which we ultimately found you guys. So we at Trek have a ERP system that kind of runs the whole business, and then we had and we still do, we have a forecasting software for finished goods planning. Neither of those things are really created for the complexities inherent with a custom business. And so, I mean, we were using the tools we had, right? And we were using the ERP system and bolting it on with the forecasting for finished goods. And anytime we tried to do something for the custom business, it was custom work back into an ERP system. And I think most companies or experiences you guys have had, no one wants to do that. They do not want to customize a standard ERP system. So trying to find something that was customizable for our business led us eventually to Lokad, and I think that's been the last couple of years actually at this point as we've been building out the tools and the process.
Well, thank you. And actually, Joannes, on that point, when Dan talks about let's say, the brittleness or maybe the limitations of an ERP for this kind of complexity, I'm sure you can expand on that quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, basically, indeed, first, ERPs in general with a transaction relies at their core on a transactional database. So transactional database, I mean SQL databases, they are just not the sort of, I would say, tools that are appropriate for most analytical processing. This is just a general consideration that is quite independent from the specific, I would say, problem that Trek had with regards to configurability. It's just, generally speaking, it's not going to do much in terms of analytics. Then where the problems, I would say, is really magnified is that what you can typically get in this sort of tools would be a classic forecast. So a classic forecast would be time series. So you start with your finished products, and then you expand according to your bill of materials. But what do we have here? I mean, first, the notion of finished products to be forecast when you have configurability becomes relatively elusive, because if you take it the naive way, then you have a near infinite amount of options. That's what I say when you have 10 options, each options have 10 configuration values, you get 10 to the power 10, which means that if you do it naively, the vast majority of all the possible configurations are never going to be sold ever. So obviously that would be the very naive way, but so the time series kind of falls apart if you take it the classical way when you look at from the finished products angle. Now there is the alternative is to say, okay, we are going to look at time series from the parts angle. And it works a little bit better, because the parts are, I mean, even if Trek is at this price point is probably one of the companies that sells the most bike worldwide, we are talking, the order of magnitude we are talking of is typically thousands or tens of thousands of bikes, a year. It's not like millions or tens of millions. So when we look at how many parts are going to be consumed for a specific part. We're going to say on a daily basis, it's just going to be very small numbers. You know, it can be just a few parts per day. Sometimes for some parts that are a bit rare, that might even be something like one part a day. So when you forecast, the problem with when forecasting at the part level is that it doesn't tell you anything about bottlenecks. So you do your forecast, but then because a bike has something like 200 parts, the odds are super, super high that even if you have super high service levels on all parts, like let's say 98% service level, which is already quite high. But then for a bike, 98%, if you have a bike with 200 parts, well, that means that there are 4 parts on average that are missing every single time. So this is a problem. You see, that's those, and if you approach the problem in saying, well, instead of having like 98% service level, we want to have like 99.9, the reality is that to get those last percent of service level, the amount of stock just completely explode. And that's not a good move. So you end up having, you know, a mountain of stock, and thus if there is, and there is in the bike industry, there is technological obsolescence. There is new technologies, you know, that are coming out. So when you have a part, it's not something that is going to last decades. It's going to last maybe 1 season, 2 seasons, and then there will be the next generation that is slightly better. And so there is a value of, not only a value of financial value, but a loss of attractiveness for customers. They want the thing from the latest generation as opposed to the thing from the older generation. So bottom line, if we go back to this ERP, you can't forecast the finished goods. You can forecast time series wise the parts, but then you end up with something where if you end up putting very high service levels, even if you go for something like 99% service level, which is exceedingly high, you still end up with, on average, for all of your bikes, you know, a few parts are missing. And then 99% is not a good place to be when you have a bit of technological obsolescence. That would mean that every single year you would generate like large quantities of dead stock, basically. I mean, stock that you will have, that you will really struggle to liquidate. And again, I think in the specific business of Trek, we have to think that Trek selling very high-end bikes, very high quality. I mean, the people who go to Trek, they don't chase like promotions. So there is, I mean, the idea that you could just liquidate your unsold parts by doing promotions, I mean, it kind of conflicts with the idea of being
prestigious,
being on the very high end. And by the way, that's the same thing with, let's say, Apple. So Apple, if they have like a big leftover of some older generation phones, they do struggle to get rid of them. I mean, because they don't want to damage their brand in also giving away those phones very, very cheap. That's not exactly how they would approach their own brands. So bottom line, what Lokad does here is we're using those probabilistic forecasts. And the probabilistic forecast is the way that gives us the idea that for every single part we can assess what is this risk of this part becoming a bottleneck and for how long. So the question is that, is this part just, are we going to be just short of 1 unit or short of 1 unit for this amount of days? So the interesting thing is that we can suddenly see the risk, not in just from a one-dimensional perspective, as in how many units are missing, but how many units/days of delays am I creating in my supply chain, which is a different way to look at it, but a much more powerful way, which means that, for example, if you have a part that sells very infrequently, but when you missed that part, it takes like 3 months for the supplier to send you another one, then that means that the punishment in terms of risk is much, much stronger on this part compared to a part that if you miss that part, the supplier can maybe send you overnight a batch of 10 pieces, you know, maybe at a price point that is slightly higher. But that's a completely different thing from I have a supplier in the US that can send me overnight the missing parts versus there is this part that only comes from Japan or for Taiwan, and it takes months if I want an extra unit. And the only way, and with a classic forecast, you can't see that at all. You know, time series are blind to this sort of things. So you need to go the probabilistic road to even be able to apprehend this sort of patterns.
Well, Dan, that's a lot of information.
Sorry.
No. It's perfect because it actually segues wonderfully, which is, Dan, how exactly did you and Trek transition from, let's say, a traditional ERP to everything Joannes just said? I can't summarize it, but it was a lot of interesting stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think we talk a lot to other parts of the business of what we're doing with Lokad, and I get a lot of head nods and kind of blank stares, and then not a lot of questions. So it means they either really understood everything we're doing, or they have no idea what the path we're going down with probabilistic forecasting. So I think it's the latter. I mean, I think we do have to still educate even people within our own business of this is a new way, a different way of doing things. And I think the way we're starting to kind of get internal allies with it is just the performance of the business. So Joannes is right. We were doing time series forecasting at the part level, and we often did have 98% service level on all the parts, which is kind of the worst place you want to be because you have all this money tied up in inventory. Your customer can't get the bike they ordered, and just no one's happy in that situation. So, I think we're seeing better decisions being made by the team. We're seeing kind of the results starting to get the thing back on track. Recovering from the pandemic has obviously, I think, made it a little bit harder and will take a little bit more time, but having different decisions based on probabilistic forecast with Lokad has been huge for us.
Well, actually, following up on that, when you kind of alluded to the day-to-day dealings with probabilistic forecasting, without going into, let's say, incredible and possibly even confidential layers of detail, I mean, what does that look like on a daily basis? I mean, when you're dealing with inventory levels on high-end configurable bikes?
Well, we try to break up because even with Lokad, you're getting a lot of decision recommendations on a daily basis, and we have a team of people that are in charge of the forecasting and buying. They can't get to it all every day, so we break it into kind of a weekly, monthly process. But the really good thing with Lokad is it floats to the top, like, hey, here are the biggest opportunities or risks, things you should look at. And then, you just kind of keep working through the list, and it changes every day. We get new data daily. So, I mean, that's really important. We take new orders from around the world every single day. So you do want to have kind of that data pipeline refreshed. So yeah, I think just having the team be able to focus much more time on evaluating the business decision recommendation has been a huge change for us. We used to spend the majority of our time just trying to come up with a decision we think we wanted to make, and a lot of it was Excel based and everything. So big, time shift of the team versus trying to generate the numbers themselves, versus now it's generated in Lokad, and now we're able to evaluate it, review it, work with suppliers, and spend a lot more time on value-added activities.
Thank you. And Joannes, I mean, we at Lokad, we apply probabilistic forecasting to a wide array of different tasks: retail stock allocation, prioritized inventory replenishment, configurability. In terms of, let's just even take those three separate topics. How complex is what we do with Trek compared to retail stock allocation or prioritized inventory replenishment?
I mean, what is done with Trek is I would say, mid-scale in terms of our own scale of difficulty. It's not as complex as, let's say, aviation, where, let's say, you have aircraft engines where just an engine is going to have like 15,000 parts. And then an aircraft itself is like 300,000 parts, and then you have to deal with the fleet, plus the fact that your client has aircraft parts in 200 airports worldwide. So and the parts fly through aircraft as well, all the time. So they are very mobile because they can use the spare capacity of their own fleet to move stuff around cheaply, which they do. That's, I would say, that's nevertheless, it is a lot more, I would say, difficult than, let's say, fashion, where it's fashion, you don't have those sort of dependencies, where you do have cannibalization, but it tends to be, I would say, soft relationship between products as opposed to hard dependencies between the parts, where if there is one that is missing, then you're stuck. So that's, I would say, a mid-level complexity, which is, again, quite a challenge, because, again, we are talking of a business that even if they are high-end bikes, the price are still, for their quality, quite competitive. So it's, again, an aircraft engine, just to give you a scale, an aircraft engine, every blade of the engine that you can see spinning would be something like $15,000 a piece, just one blade. So obviously, when every single piece and a keyboard in an aircraft cabin is like $20,000. So when every single part counts in $10,000 plus, you can incur crazy supply chain overheads, and it's still okay. In their case, in the case of Trek, they are still quite competitive. I mean, obviously they are the high end, but nevertheless, this is for the price that they charge. It is competitive. Thus, they have to be efficient. So they can, again, this is not the same order. So that's why I say, yes, it's middle complexity, but the cost factor is much more prevalent than what you would observe, let's say, in aerospace. And now another factor is, which is quite interesting, is that through probabilistic forecast, you can approach the problems through multiple dimensions. For example, ordering is just one of the type of decisions that you can take. You can also, without going to the secrets, Trex has, I would say, a close relationship with many of its suppliers, and thus orders can be slowed down or accelerated. So that's another type of decision. So it's not just the quantity, is that when you have a good relationship with a supplier, you can modulate also orders that are already in progress to accelerate them a little bit or slow them down a little bit. So that's also another dimension where it's not just about a fire and forget. There is a bit of ongoing, I would say, supplier relationship management. And then when you have also multiple locations, so Trek has multiple locations, there is an element of inventory rebalancing between the location that happens. So again, that's interesting because, again, when you look at it from the lenses of the classic forecast, it's just time series, you're supposed to know the future. All those things don't even make sense. I mean, if you know the future, why would you ever rebalance? You know, you know the future, so you just have to orchestrate the execution. You don't need to re-discuss with your supplier what is in progress. You don't need to rebalance your stock. You just have your one perfect plan and you just orchestrate it. But when you go, I would say, into those probabilities where things can, gradually, the priorities can gradually be evolve, where stuff, as the situation evolves with every extra orders, you can have something that gradually bubble up to the top and become the new high priority things. It's not like you have a change and then everything is completely reset with completely different priorities, but it means that everything that happened in your supply chain is going to nudge the rank at the rank level, the rank of every single thing that you have in your outline. Some stuff are going to move up toward the top or downward toward the bottom. And I would say the through probabilistic forecast, you have a much more, I would say, incremental expense, as opposed to something where you refresh the forecast, you get different forecasts, and then all your planning has to be redone from scratch with a new forecast. It's Lokad, we can recompute new probabilistic forecasts, and then very frequently people, when we say we recompute new forecasts on a daily basis, we'd say, oh, it should drive every practitioner completely crazy because suddenly all the planning is done completely differently. But the reality is that when you go into those sort of prioritization sort of view, when you recompute the forecast, it just means that there is every day the ranks of everything just shift a little bit up or down, and the changes are nowhere as drastic as in, I would say, the classical perspective when you recompute your classic time series forecast.
Well, when you talk, and Dan, I'll come back to you, when you've dealt with the classical perspective, as Joannes just described, for so long, and then you introduce probabilistic forecasting, a purely financially driven perspective, embracing the uncertainty of future demand, how exactly do you sell those concepts to people who are hearing them for the first time? So they're not like you, they don't understand these things immediately. How does that conversation go?
I think I was trying to allude to it a little bit earlier. We do talk about it internally to other parts of Trek, and I still think there's a pretty big barrier to understanding. The classic time series it's what you learn in school, it's what you were taught when you had your first job. I mean, it's just really what's rooted in supply chain, forecasting, purchasing, business. I do think, with the AI is kind of everywhere now over the last so suddenly, whether it's good or bad, people tend to be more perceptive to, oh, you're doing a machine learning based thing. Like I've actually kind of heard about, I think what I've heard about is what you're doing.
Computers.
Yeah, computers. So I do think that's helped, but it is going to be, showing the results. It's going to take some long-term performance of the business, and then I think that's how we'll start seeing more people picking it up, internally to Trek or other industries, we talk to, and they're interested in what we're doing as well.
Joannes, is that how you explain it when you're not at work? Just at a dinner party? Is that how you sell this to people?
Yeah, I mean, the gist of it is that as soon as you give up on the idea that you know the future, it becomes a lot more complicated. It would be so much easier if the future was just the symmetric of the past, if you could just have, because time series for the past is the correct way to look at the past. You can look at those time series for the past. They are what happened. There is no uncertainty. I mean, there might be a clerical error here and there where somebody miscounted a part, in the historical records, but the odds of this is super low. I mean, companies that have correct processes with barcodes and whatnot, the sort of clerical error rates we're talking is less than 1/1,000. So essentially, the clerical errors are almost non-existent. So your time series are almost 100% accurate, historically speaking. And then you go into the future, and then it becomes massively, massively inaccurate, like 50% inaccurate. And also they are even contingent on decisions that have yet to be made. Because the interesting thing is that, for example, and I'm not disclosing things that are secret because you can see that through the Project One configurator online, but I've checked this configurator over the month, and it changes. I mean, there is novelty, things are not presented exactly the same way, so it's not like there is a configurator and it's an immutable offering of Trek. It's something that in itself, every month there is something that comes to this configurator. Some stuff are phased out as well. So obviously, if Trek decide to modify their offering, so what is being proposed in this configurator, it is fairly evident that it will have an impact on the future demand. But if you look at the future through the lenses of the time series, where does those evolution of the configurators themselves, so where does those evolutions, take place? The answer is nowhere. They can't even exist in those, traditional time series. Thus, we have uncertainty, but we have also another problem, which is we have the contingency on decisions that have yet to be made, such as evolution of the configurator. And so it is unfortunate, but as soon as you say, well, we are going to deal with this uncertainty, we are going to deal with those evolution of the configurator, yes, it becomes more complicated, but I would say it's a price to pay to deal with the actual complexity that pre-exists Lokad, as opposed to pretend it doesn't exist. You see, I really differentiate when I say it's more complex or complicated, is it a vendor that has not made enough effort in his technology. So the vendor has a super complex technology, but it might be just accidental complexity. There is no value. It might just be Lokad may have just over-engineer everything, and so everything is like over-complicated for no good reason. Or is it like essential complexity? The complexity is in the business. It pre-exists Lokad. Uncertainty exists whether we want it or not. For example, the biking industry went through a boom during the lockdowns, and then there was like the exit of this boom. I mean, Lokad didn't cause that. This is just what it is. And then the evolution of the configurator, same thing. I mean, it's I know that Trek follows very closely a lot of sport events like Tour de France in France. And so there is all this sort of evolution of the offering that kind of matches those sports events. Again, there is this complexity pre-exists Lokad, and so the way I typically present that, that's a long-winded answer to your question.
But at the dinner party, yeah.
We didn't. We didn't shoot first. You did. I mean, this complexity is kind of on you, but also it is a good complexity because it's complexity that creates value for the customers. Yeah. Having an offering that evolves with the sport events, I believe that biking fans, racers, they love this sort of things. I mean, that's staying relevant in this market. And same thing, having low lead times and whatnot. It is again, the clients they love that, but it creates a lot of complexity that has to be addressed. But that's and thus, probabilistic forecast is just the mirror of this pre-existing complexity, and as opposed to just pretend it doesn't exist, we face it, and yeah, it's a bit complicated, but I think it's not that complicated. I mean, to be honest, it is a bit, but at the end of the day, I believe that the list of priorities, it's not something where you need a PhD in math to kind of understand what we recommend. At the end of the day, it's a prioritized list of what you should order, the touch point you should have with your suppliers, the stock rebalancing that needs to happen most urgently. Underneath, the calculations are very complex, but the reality, people have even forgotten about that, is that when you just do a multiplication of floating point numbers in your computer, there is stuff that are fairly advanced that are happening under the hood. For example, very few people would have a clear view of what is the role of the mantissa when you do the multiplication of floating point numbers. Most people would just say, what the mantissa? Well, it turned out that it's one of the key ingredients if you want to do multiplication of floating point numbers, but the reality is that it's a technicalities, and as the end user, you don't really care. You just get the end result, and that's it.
I just tell people we save them money.
Yeah.
And that's what I say. All right, well, Dan, I'm mindful of your time, so as is customary here, I'd like to give the last word to our guests. Is there any advice you would give people who are struggling with configurability, or anything you really want to say at all on supply chain?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll put a little plug in for Trek. If you're a bike retailer and you're looking to sell configured bikes, you should become a Trek retailer and sell Project One bikes.
Pretty good.
Yeah. I guess outside of the biking industry, I mean, we've been doing this custom thing for a while. So I would say the first thing is really understand what value it adds to your customer, depending on the product you're providing. We have a really good product team here at Trek. We've also at times offered things that didn't go over as well with our customers. So I think it's just really important to understand before you go down the path, what does configurability offer? The second one is I really do think it's important to have good systems to help you manage the complexity. And for us, that's become Lokad now. We didn't have it when we started, and just as the business has grown, it's really become a necessity for us. And whether it's Lokad, which we feel strongly it is, or it's someone else, I mean, you just need to have a strong foundation of your systems. And then the last one is you really do need a supply chain that can be reactive and can, be set up to be responsive to a custom business, because you are going to get it wrong. that's kind of the nature of it. Nothing's ever 100% right. And I think if you do those three things, you can have a pretty good chance at a good product in the configured space.
I agree. All right. Well, I think I'll draw things to a close. Joannes, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Dan, thank you very much for yours. And thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next time.